Today is July 14, 2017, and it's a beautiful day coming into the Sabbath, and we'll be continuing our investigation of the community rule. Before beginning, let's ask our Heavenly Family to help us to understand. Heavenly Family, thank you so very much for the principles that you've given us to understand. Help us to understand them better. Please guide us to see where we are in need of improvement. Help us to advance each day, removing all that is not according to truth and learning the way things really are. So please guide us as we continue to study the community rule. Help us to discern its true character and to judge it rightly. Help us to learn the process of investigation, and in all things to be able to apply the principles to our lives each day. Help us to be the people of love that you've been trying to produce for all these many years. Thank you. We ask this, Father and Mother, in the name of Branch, he and she. Amen.
Amen.
Okay, so in continuing the study of the community rule, I'll still give a brief recap of what it is, why it's important, and so on, as well as reminding everyone of where we are at in our studies at the present time. So the community rule is a particular literary composition that was unknown to mankind for almost 2,000 years. It was lost to history, so far as we are able to tell, in the year 68 of the Common Era, when it, along with many other scrolls, were hid in several caves on the northwestern shore of the Dead Sea in order to preserve them from destruction by oncoming Roman troops. Those scrolls, known as the Dead Sea Scrolls, were just left in those caves for those 2,000 years nearly until 1946, at the end of the year, or possibly the beginning of 1947. It's a little bit uncertain, when the first of those scrolls was discovered by Bedouin. And among those very first scrolls was a very well-preserved copy of the community rule. The community rule is important for a number of reasons. Some of the main reasons, without going into details, are first, that it tells us an awful lot about the community who had and copied the scrolls. Second, because it provides us with a lot of background information for the Jesus movement of the first century, otherwise known as the Netzarim, or the Nazarenes. And another primary reason is because it has a lot of valuable insight into the nature of truth, the nature of morality, and the nature of the human mind, the human psyche. In other words, it has profound things to say on its own right, even independent of its historical importance. So one could say that it is important for history as well as philosophy And you could even extend that to psychology, since it has a lot to say about the nature of humanity, not in terms of the physical nature per se, but in terms of the mental nature, the character. So with that said, we've been studying the community rule for over a year and a half, and we are really trying to find out what it has to say. And we understand that since there is there's an over 2,000-year gap between our time and the time in which it was written, since it was written in the first half of the 2nd century before the Common Era. And those 2,000 years provide us with a lot of change, and some of that change creates mental obstacles for understanding a text like this. And the reason why is because we have certain ways that we view the world, and the author or authors of the community rule had certain ways in which he, she, or they viewed the world, and they aren't the same. Just as today, if you look at humanity from a global perspective, there is no one way to view the world. There are many different ways. People have many different perspectives and many different paradigms which shape the way they think about nearly everything. Well, just as much as there is diversity of perspective today, and that diversity of perspective often creates misunderstanding cross-culturally, just so there's diversity of perspective temporally, in other words, across time. And thus we can have cross-temporal miscommunication. We have this even in continuations of culture. We have the broad Western culture, and I'll just give an example. The King James Version of the Bible, translated in 1611, of course, is an English translation of the Bible, which was made in the Western world. So it's part of the Western culture, and even in the English-speaking subculture of the Western world. And there's a word that is used in the King James translation that is conversation. And there's a translation of a particular Pauline passage which says something like, keep your conversation pure. And, so that sounds all good. Keep your conversation pure. Well, today, how do we understand the word conversation? The way that we understand it is referred to communication verbally between individuals. Typically, now we have, of course, online conversations, text conversations, and all of that. But it's a communication between two or more individuals, and that's basically how we understand it. And so many commentators, upon that passage of Paul's writings, who were basing their understanding off the King James Bible, understood it in that light. That being that what Paul was talking about is saying that we need to make sure that we talk in a way that is pure, that we have the content of our conversation be focused on holy or spiritual things. But guess what? That understanding of that passage has to do with a cross-temporal misunderstanding. Even within the English-speaking Western culture, the word conversation in 1611 did not mean what it means today. In 1611, your conversation is your manner of life, your way of living. So in 1611, when someone picked up that verse, they understood Paul to be speaking of, let your way of life, your manner of life be pure. And that is actually accurate. That's an accurate translation of the Greek underlying that translation. But time went on, and the English language developed, and we came to understand the word conversation in a different way, and thus we have this cross-temporal misunderstanding. Okay, so now let's take this principle and place it over a period of time that lasts over 2,000 years. And we're going from Hebrew to English. Well, there's huge potential for cross-temporal misunderstanding and cross-cultural misunderstanding as well. Because, let's face it, Palestine, 2nd century BCE, isn't really a modern Western culture. So, because of this, we are aware of our need to submerge ourselves in the 2nd century BCE Jewish world in order to accurately understand what the community rule and other texts like this were saying. So we need to understand that, even if we have a certain perspective as to the way the world works, they may have had a different perspective. And in order to understand what they're saying, we have to understand those broad perspectives. So that's our first task, trying to understand it for what it says rather than misrepresenting it. And the reason why we so desperately want to avoid misrepresenting it is because we intend to judge the truth value of the claims of this text. In other words, we want to find what are the claims that this text makes, and then we want to test whether those claims correspond to material reality. Well, if we misunderstand the text, then we will not be judging or testing the text. We will only be testing and judging our misunderstanding, our skewed mental image of the text. And that won't tell us anything about the nature of the text itself. So we want to understand what the text is really about, and we want to judge the claims that the text makes to see whether they are true. And in particular, we want to keep our eyes out to see whether the text makes claims concerning its own nature as to whether it is a product of divine inspiration or not. One of the reasons for having that sort of claim in mind is because the manner in which we must go about testing this text will differ greatly depending on whether the text claims to be a product of inspiration or not. You ask different questions when you're testing a text as to whether it claims divine inspiration versus whether it claims to have its primary interest as being history or biology or whatever. So, for example, if you came across an ancient text and it is giving, it's basically about botany, plant life, and so on and so forth. Well, the way that you would test its accuracy is to compare it to plants and the reality of what plants are like. If you find an ancient text that is claiming to give history, and that's its primary purpose, that was the primary purpose of the author, then the way that you test it is to examine what it has to say about history and whether it matches the way things really were in the past as can be determined according to present evidence. If a text claims to be a telling or a record or an expression of a message that is from a particular God, and if it makes claims concerning that God, well, then that changes the types of questions that we need to ask. For example, the God represented in the community rule is a God that absolutely abhors falsehood, a God that cares all about truth and has as his primary focus to purify people from sin. Another way to put that is to transform people so that they no longer act in a way or think in a way which is contrary to truth or reality. So since that is the God represented in the community rule, if the community rule claims to be a product of divine inspiration from that God, and then if we find that any of the main points that are brought out that are claiming to be a message from that God are actually not true, well, then it's self-contradicting in its claim, and thus would be false. So a text which claims to be a product of divine inspiration from a God who speaks pure truth, that text must be without error insofar as the ideas put forth are concerned. You have to examine its claims or its understanding as to the nature of inspiration. If it is still claiming its author as human and a fallible human, well, then, of course, there may be misunderstandings and so on and so forth that don't have really a bearing on the overall point that is being put forth. And that's totally fine. And, of course, we have had a series of studies actually going through the principles of inspiration. They go a lot more into that than I will here. But that's essentially why we have in mind to see whether any given ancient text we study claims divine inspiration, or if it claims to be primarily a book of history or whatever. Like whatever it is, whatever book we read, we want to know what it claims for itself. What does it claim concerning its purpose? Or more accurately, what does the author claim concerning his or her purpose within the text? And then we judge it according to that purpose. That intended purpose helps us to know what sort of questions to ask. And of course, since our primary interest is morality and the solution for immorality, if a text does claim to be a product of divine inspiration, and if it is interested in expounding upon moral precepts, we want to judge the moral claims to see whether they correspond with material reality. And that, of course, plays a huge part in deciding how we will ultimately view the text. So the community rule is a really interesting text, and it so far in investigating it, certainly puts forward a system of morality that is absolutely based in truth, and to which we or I'll say with which we entirely agree. Now, at this point in the community rule, or at this point in our studies of the community rule, we have come to a natural change of content or focus within the text. Our primary study has been focusing on the best preserved copy of the community rule, known as 1QS. It's the one that was found in the first Qumran cave. And it has 11 columns. We've gone through the first 4 and are now beginning to discuss the 5th column. And in doing so, we're getting into issues such as textual criticism, the comparative study of manuscripts of a particular text in order to discover the history of the wording of the text itself. And so we talked about that last time, and we read a section from the Encyclopedia of the Dead Sea Scrolls. I believe it was edited, or at least had as its chief editors, Lawrence Schiffman and James Vanderkam. And we read the article in that encyclopedia on the community rule, and it covered a lot of the scholarly analysis of the textual history and the redactional history of the history of the editing of the text. So not only do we have the wording, but we have the form of the text, as in its overall layout. Does it start with a section describing the purpose of the community rule, entering into the covenant, and then the treatise on the two spirits? Or does it start with the material that parallels column 5 of 1QS, which is describing kind of what things are supposed to be like within the community? Well, some manuscripts start one way, some start another way. So that's the actual form of the text is different in different manuscripts. And so this raises questions like, was the community rule originally one document that is only a section within what we now think of as the community rule, as represented in, say, 1QS, and then other parts were added to it? Or maybe there were several originally independent documents that were then stitched together. Another possibility is that, let's say, 1QS is representative of the original form of the text, and then later people made copies of certain portions of the community rule. This makes a big difference as to how we view it. Is it originally several independent documents, potentially by different authors, or is it one literary unit by a single author? Or is it one literary unit by multiple authors, where people collaborated deliberately to produce the community rule? These are all things that we need to consider. And so those are some of the issues that we have been discussing lately in our community rule studies. And the next thing that we're basically going to do is read a little introductory section to the Cave 4 manuscripts of the community rule. And this introduction is found in Volume 1 of the Princeton Dead Sea Scrolls project series on the Dead Sea Scrolls. It's known as Rule of the Community and Related Documents. So we want to read that whether it's tonight or tomorrow night. Tonight would be great, but if there are comments and questions on the community rule that end up taking up the whole rest of our meeting, then we won't get through it tonight. So that said, does anyone have any comments or questions which in some way relate to the community rule? Okay, it doesn't sound like there are comments or questions. In that case, let's get into a little bit of the scholarly material on the community rule. So I just need to find where it gets into the Cave 4 manuscripts. Okay. So this, what we are about to read, is found on page 53 of the aforementioned volume, that being, again, Volume 1, Rule of the Community and Related Documents, of the critical edition of the Dead Sea Scrolls published by the Princeton Theological Seminary Dead Sea Scrolls Project, edited by James Charlesworth. So we won't read the introduction to 1QS. It seems to be more of an introduction to the community rule itself and not so much getting into the manuscript issues. And right now, what we're more interested in is the manuscript issues. So this introduction to the Cave 4 fragments has several different sections. This is just a couple pages. It's really just pages 53 and 54 in this book. So it shouldn't take too long for us to go through. So the first section is texts and original language. This is what it says. 12 copies of the Rule of the Community have been identified in the Qumran caves. Cave 1 preserves 1QS, which is the only full copy of the Serek HaYahad, which is the Hebrew name of the Rule of the Community or the Community Rule. Cave 5 contained a fragment some way related to this document, 5Q11. Most copies were recovered from Cave 4, which preserved 10 fragmentary manuscripts of the work. Unfortunately, as with the other scrolls found in Cave 4, the copies are not well preserved. Each fragment consists of numerous other fragments, which were originally assigned to J.T. Millick for publication. E. Qumran's reading of the texts appears following this introduction. So there's his reading of the text. That's what is provided in this particular publication. A summary chart giving physical descriptions and paleography of the 4QS MSSA through J follows this introduction. And I just want to ask here, do you guys remember what paleography is? And if so, maybe someone here could explain it.
Paleography is study of writings from different centuries, perhaps?
I was going to say, in addition to that, the study of ancient cultures, which could include archaeology and ancient writings.
Okay, so both of those explanations of paleography are actually broader than what paleography actually is. So there are two different aspects. Paleography. Do you guys know what paleo means?
like history or ancient people?
Yeah, it has to do with ancient things. So, and I don't know the exact breakdown of the word, if it has more of a, like if it just simply means ancient or, antiquity, or if it means pre-something. But essentially, you have things like Paleo-Judaica. That's the name of a blog by James Davila, who's a scholar of ancient Judaism. And Paleo-Judaica means basically ancient Judaism. So anything that relates to ancient Judaism is, really the topic of the blog Paleo-Judaica. And so paleo has to do with ancient, yes. How about graphy?
Isn't that writing? Means writing?
Yeah. Yeah, so paleography is ancient writing. So it is comparing different texts from different centuries and so on, but it's a far more narrow discipline. So you have historians who specialize in Israelite history from the First Temple period. And then you have people who focus on Second Temple Israelite history. And especially those who focus on Second Temple Israelite history, but also the others, they focus on comparing texts. But their goal is to find the reality of the events of the past. In other words, the true history of the events of the past. Paleography, on the other hand, isn't so much concerned with events. What it has to do with is specifically the form of the letters in the handwriting of ancient texts and how the form of the letters developed over time. So typically, paleography is used to chronicle the historical development of the form of the actual handwriting of scribes in the ancient world, and that is used in order to determine the date of manuscripts. So, for example, you could have in Hebrew, to give some broad pictures on this, in the days of, let's say, the 10th century BCE and the 11th century BCE, this is where we have the very first Hebrew inscriptions. Well, Hebrew was almost pictographic in that period. The letters themselves looked very different from what we think of today as Hebrew letters. But then, coming into maybe the 9th century BCE and lasting until the 5th century BCE or thereabouts, there was another form of letters, and that form is really the form of letters that was used by Isaiah and Ezekiel and Jeremiah, and that form of letters is known as Paleo-Hebrew. But then, in the 5th century BCE, possibly going into the 4th, sometime around the Babylonian exile or just after it, probably just after the Babylonian exile, the Jews took on Aramaic square script, so a different form of the letters, actually a different set of characters to write their language. And it is actually Aramaic characters, but they were brought into use to write down the Hebrew language. And so Paleo-Hebrew characters fell out of style, and Aramaic square script came into style.
I have a question on that.
Sure.
Different characters, do you mean the letters are completely different? Or, because I've seen the two, I thought they were just almost like having a different font. But it sounds like maybe some of them were completely different letters altogether.
Yeah, I think what you're thinking of is actually different fonts. It depends on exactly what you're thinking of. But what I'm referring to is actually totally different shapes to represent each letter. So right now, we write the letter Aleph in a certain way with certain strokes and so on. Paleo-Hebrew wrote the letter Aleph in an entirely different way, different strokes and all of that. And then pictographic Hebrew, even more ancient, was different again. So we have three primary stages to the actual form of the letters for the Hebrew language. Originally, it was some sort of pictographic type thing, and then for the period in which the bulk of the Hebrew Bible was written, it was what we call Paleo-Hebrew, where the letters looked very different from what we think of as Hebrew. It was a totally different thing. And then in the 5th or 4th century BCE, just after the Babylonian exile, the Aramaic characters were adopted and used to write the Hebrew language. Now that gives like the basic, periods of the development of the letters of the Hebrew alphabet. But paleography gets more specific than that. It looks at, in the ancient world, most people couldn't really write. Or if they could, maybe it was just like their name, something like that. But most people couldn't sit down and write a scroll. And so most people who did this were trained professionally as scribes. And so there wasn't as much variety in handwriting styles because it was a smaller group of people and they were all professionally trained. And so one person's writing looked a lot like the next person's writing. It's not like today where, I can write something down and then Teresa writes something down and it looks totally different. It's just we have a greater variety. In the ancient world, it was a lot less variety between scribes. And because of that, the overall trends of how things are written that are shared by scribes is really easier to track in shorter periods of time. I mean, even today you can. If you look at how the letter S has been written typically in the English language over the centuries, you'll see that it might be different. If you compare how it is today versus how it was in the year 1500, pretty different. And if you look at the actual letters, let's say in a facsimile copy of Wycliffe's Bible, it looks almost like a different language. So you can do that today, but today a lot more people write, and there's greater variety in writing in a generation versus 2,000 years ago. So paleography is able to look and see, one of the trends that took place is as time went on, writing Hebrew, even in the Second Temple period, at one point, earlier on in the Second Temple period, the way that letters were written, they were not all quite the same size. There was less uniformity in the size of the letters. So just as a hypothetical example, a lamed would be a lot bigger than an aleph, let's say. But as time went on, they became more uniform in their size. And then there's different things the letter lamed has this long stroke that goes up. Well, how long is that stroke? Well, in different periods, scribes made it longer or shorter. And so by studying the overall way that letters were written in different periods, and especially if you have something that this text comes from this period, then you can use that as like a standard to compare other texts, and then you get a larger and larger database for comparison. And so paleographical analysis will take an ancient text and say, okay, let's try and determine the date of this actual manuscript. Like, when did the scribe who copied this manuscript actually copy it? And paleography says, hey, you know what? Based on the length of this particular stroke of the letter Lamed and the degree of similarity in the size of the letters, and based off of the stroke of this letter and the stroke of that letter, and like all these particulars of the way that the letters are actually written, they could say, well, this comes from between the years 200 BCE and 150 BCE. And in paleography, typically, like, you can't really narrow it down more than a 50-year period. Like, you can't say, based on paleography, like, oh, this was totally copied in the year 176 BCE. Because, of course, the scribe who might write it in 176 is going to write it the same way in 175. So it can only give you, like, basically like a 50-year period of time in which we know that the Hebrew letters were written in this particular way. And so, you know, it's a way to date manuscripts. So that's what paleography is. So, I just wanted to ask, thank you guys, by the way, for explaining how you understand it. I hope that this explanation clarified more specifically what paleography is. It's always good to make sure that we understand what we're reading. Okay, so I'll read that last sentence again, and then we'll continue on. A summary chart giving physical descriptions and paleography of the 4QS MSS A through J. Now, what that means is MSS is the abbreviation for manuscripts. So the 4QS, which is the Cave for Serach HaYahad manuscripts A through J. So in other words, there's a summary chart giving, here's the physical description of this particular fragment, and here's the paleography of it. In other words, it will say, like, based on paleography, this particular fragment was copied in, between the years 50 and the year 1 BCE. Something like that. The chart also presents, for each Cave 4 fragment of the rule of the community, the parallel passage in 1QS, and the PAM photographs used to prepare this edition, and the Rockefeller Museum plate numbers. So that's actually quite useful. So basically, there were different photographs that were taken, and they were numbered, and this gives the numbers for each fragment so that if someone has a book or a microfilm edition of the actual fragments of the Dead Sea Scrolls, they can look up the number of the fragment and compare the in-print transcription of the fragment with actual picture of the fragment itself. A study of these fragments indicates that the errors in transmission and the variants tend to confirm the conclusion that the original language of the Serach HaYahad is Hebrew. Next section, date and provenance. So date, we all know what that means. Provenance is the place of origin. The paleography of these fragments varies. Some fragments are in the Hasmonean script, viz. 4QS manuscript C. Now, Hasmonean, that's talking about like in the days of the Maccabees, basically. And not just the Maccabees as in the Maccabean revolt, but the period after the revolt was done, when the Maccabee family, the Hasmoneans, were ruling the Jewish people until Herod the Great arose. So you have the Hasmonean period, which is from the 160s BCE, lasting about 100 years until, if I'm remembering correctly, lasting about 100 years until the 60s of the 1st century BCE, which starts the Herodian period. So some fragments are in the Hasmonean script, others are in the later Herodian script, viz. 4QS manuscript D. 2 were written on papyrus, but most were copied on leather. And it's giving examples here, but I'm not going to read all the, 4QS, MSS, A, and C, and, all of that. Obviously, all the compositions that were collected into the rule of the community must, in their earliest form, antedate circa 100 BCE because of the paleographical date assigned to 1QS. So basically what this is saying is that the compositions, the times when each section of the community rule was originally composed, must be before the year 100 BCE, because the actual copy 1QS comes from 100 BC or before. So therefore, obviously, the copy of a text cannot be older than the original text. Some of the Cave 4 fragments may well antedate 1QS. So some of the Cave 4 manuscripts might be older than 1QS, the Cave 1 manuscript. But the relations among these fragments and 1QS and their date should not be discerned solely on the basis of paleography. The dating of handwriting cannot be sufficiently precise in this case. The fragments from Cave 4 are diverse, and the handwriting represents virtually the spectrum of Second Temple scripts. So in other words, the handwriting varies a lot. There's stuff that is from quite a large spectrum of periods in the Second Temple period. The textual history of the transmission of the copies of the rule of the community indicates that we should not think about the copying of an original text, as is almost always the case with the copying of books in the Biblia Hebraica, the Hebrew Bible, after the 1st century CE. Each fragmentary manuscript has a unique history. Finally, the individual compositions were collected into the rule book of the Qumran community. A re-examination of 1QS indicates that it is an imperfect copy. The errors, the corrections, and the supralinear additions, which are not always corrections, in 1QS indicate that it is unwise to assume it is the final or best version of this important collection of rules.
That's interesting.
Yeah, very interesting. And when it talks about supralinear additions, that's talking about things like writing in between the lines. So the scribe who wrote 1QS may have written other notes or other things, additions and corrections and things like that above a particular line. Or maybe, and I think that this is the case, where another scribe came along and wrote other additions or corrections and that sort of thing, or different readings even.
And this may be obvious to everyone, but just in case, I'll just spell out that he's saying additions, ADDIT, instead of editions, and like additions. This right. Addition, that addition. It's not EDITI, it's ADDI.
Yes, thank you for specifying that. So, continuing on, it says, it has been customary to refer to 10 copies of the rule of the community preserved in Cave 4. Actually, they may be, in many cases, copies of documents, like the hymn of column 11, which evolved separately and were finally collected together into the rule of the community. So what he's pointing out is that it might not be that it's a fragmentary copy of the community rule. It might be that it's a copy of one of the particular documents that were later compiled into the community rule. But of course, that all still has to be verified as to whether that is the case, that it's originally independent documents that were later compiled. While each manuscript may not be assumed prima facie to be part of a complete scroll of the rule of the community, some fragments represent the document in an evolved state. For example, manuscript D preserves a text parallel to columns 5 to 11 of 1QS, and manuscript B represents a text parallel to columns 1 to 10 of 1QS. The Cave 4 fragments represent composition history, not transmission history. The difference, of course, when it's saying that the 4Q fragments represent composition history, not transmission history, that's a really important statement, because that's saying that it's not just, here's a complete text and now let's transmit it down from generation to generation. Like, let's just copy it exactly as it is because it's already a completed thing. When this is saying that it's a composition history, it's saying that they represent different phases of the evolution of the document itself, or the composition itself, the community rule. So we'll be testing this as we go. The final product represents the life of the Qumran community and received its final form at Qumran. Next, history and theology. In discerning the theology of the 4QS fragments, two allowances should be made. First, they tend to represent the theology found in 1QS. Second, the variance between the fragments and 1QS sometimes reveal a theology not always identical to that found in 1QS. Now, if that's the case, that can potentially be very helpful for us. If the different manuscripts actually show changes in theology, it will make it easier for us to trace. Continuing. Text criticism and theology are significantly and at times uniquely linked here in research. The variant readings in the Cave 4 fragments are clarified in the notes to the translation of 1QS, indicated in the translations of each fragment, and highlighted in the notes to the translations of the Cave 4 fragments. The variants are frequently of unusual interest. For example, 4QS manuscript E includes a reference to the Mikdas, which seems to refer to the Qumran community as a sanctuary. If it does, then we find an unexpected confirmation of the well-known conclusion that the holy ones at Qumran conceived of their own Yahad as the temple. Also in 4QS manuscript E, there is the following transition upon a single fragment. Quote, "This alludes to the study of the Torah, which he commanded through Moses. These are the statutes by which the master shall walk in them." Now that goes from what is paralleled in 1QS column 8, line 15, to what is paralleled in 1QS column 9, line 11. So this says here, "That means this manuscript does not contain the locus classicus of Qumran messianism, which is in 1QS column 9, line 11, until the coming of the prophet and the messiahs of Aaron and Israel." In other words, that particular copy of the community rule, or this section which was later compiled into the community rule, does not contain that classical statement on quote-unquote Qumran messianism. Messianism is basically messianic beliefs about the Messiah or the Messiahs. If 4QS manuscript E, though paleographically later than 1QS, represents an earlier version of the rule of the community, and if it reflects the life of the community at Qumran before it expanded with the inclusion of new members and the physical expansion of the buildings, then it is conceivable that the Qumranites, under the direction of the righteous teacher, did not necessarily believe in the coming of a Messiah, and that this messianic idea was an aspect of the development of Qumran theology. Now, he's just mentioning this as a hypothetical example to say, hey, if this fragment represents a more original version of the community rule and it did not have this messianic idea, it's possible that under the teacher of righteousness they were not expecting a future Messiah to come, and that later, in a later version of the community rule, they had messianic expectations and included them in those copies of the community rule. So that's a possibility, but it needs to be verified. This hypothetical conclusion is only a conjecture, which is basically what I was just saying. It depends on much reconstruction of Qumran history and considerable synthesis, which is premature at this stage, except as scholarly conjecture. For reflections on other issues raised by the contents of the rule of the community, please consult the introduction to 1QS, its translation, and notes. The fragments of the rule of the community have a complex history. It will take many critical articles and monographs to assess the full story they provide. Next, here is just a section on the translation of the K4 fragments, which I'm not going to read because it's not essential for addressing the questions which we are presently asking. So I just want to ask, does anyone have any comments or questions on any of what I just read? All right, it doesn't sound like there are comments or questions. I hope you guys were able to follow the content. I tried to explain some of the parts that might seem harder to understand, but with what it said in this last little section, it does kind of make me want to go back and read the introduction to 1QS from this same volume, because this introduction was actually quite helpful, I found. Mm-hmm. So maybe tomorrow night we'll read the introduction to 1QS, and then something that we can do as we go through the study of 1QS column 5 is I'll have all these other like I'll be reading from this edition, which has notes to compare all the differences between how it is in 1QS and how it is in the Cave 4 Fragments, and that will help us to analyze the state of the text. And in fact, we may even just read each manuscript on its own. But anyway, it sounded maybe like someone came off mute, so I just wanted to check again if anyone had any comments or questions on this.
Yeah, that was me. I was just wanting to say that it is really helpful for you to interject those short explanations. I'm not saying I'm absorbing every single thing, but yeah, it's been really helpful to have those inserted there. And I guess I'll go ahead and, I don't know, comment or ask a question, although I hate to sound so lacking of understanding there. But not too long ago you mentioned that they may or may not have been looking for a future Messiah, but maybe it was at a later date. I may have just missed part of it there. What would make us think that? Because it just wasn't in the writings? Can you go over that one more time to refresh my memory on that?
Sure, yeah, that's an excellent question. So basically, there are multiple different manuscripts of the community rule or of the documents which were later compiled into the community rule. And in 1QS, so that's the Cave 1 manuscript, the one that's best preserved and the one that we've been really studying in all of our community rule studies. In column 9, line 11 of 1QS, it says, ... until the coming of the prophet and the messiahs of Aaron and Israel. And so there it has an expectation of this will be the case until the coming of the prophet and the messiahs of Aaron and Israel. So there, whoever wrote that, when it was written, there was a future expectation of, in fact, a prophet and messiahs, the messiahs of Aaron and Israel. Now that's in 1QS, that's in that copy. But in another copy, that part is not there.
Oh,
and in fact, there's this whole section that's not there. And so what James Charlesworth and E. Kim Rohn, who wrote this little introduction, what they were saying is that if the manuscript which does not have the reference to the prophet and the messiahs of Aaron and Israel, if the one that doesn't have that reference is older, and let's say it goes back to the days of the teacher of righteousness, and then the one in 1QS is later, then it might show that in the days of the teacher of righteousness, they were not expecting a future Messiah, but then later, after he died and things moved on, they were expecting another prophet to come and the messiahs of Aaron and Israel. Now, he pointed out that this is just a hypothetical example in order to illustrate how the differences between these manuscripts may actually be very significant in showing us the development of the theology of the Qumran community.
The differences.
Yeah. So the differences between the manuscripts may be just really significant in showing that. And he's not trying to say that this is the case with this example of the messiahs, but he's just saying, hey, if this is older and all these other things, then it might show that. And this is just showing the potential of studying these variants between these manuscripts and what it might be able to show us concerning the history of the theology of the group.
And can you comment on the fact that as that was written, it said messiahs plural? Did they have an understanding of something, or was it just because they said messiahs, of Aaron and Israel? Were they making it plural because of that, or were they referring to two messiahs?
Right. So it seems to be one of the kind of features of Qumran theology, at least at some phase of its development, where they had an understanding that there would be two messiahs, a priestly messiah and a kingly messiah. And so the plural reflects the idea of there being two messiahs, but notice they have two messiahs and the prophet. So what exactly that is, not totally sure. I know James Tabor basically argues that they had an idea of kind of what might be thought of as three messiahs, where you have one that's the prophet, who is like Moses, right? Like the whole idea of like, there shall arise a prophet like unto thee, a prophet like Moses, Deuteronomy 18. So there will be the prophet, like the great expected prophet, a prophet like Moses. But then there's the idea of a kingly Messiah, like kings were anointed. They were anointed ones, messiahs. And so you have the idea of the Messiah being a king, but then you also have the idea of a Messiah being a priest. Basically, every priest was anointed. So Aaron, he was anointed, and thus he was an anointed one, Mashiach, Messiah. And so you have a messianic image that's priestly, you have a messianic image that's kingly, and then you have this prophet like Moses idea, and in a way he's an anointed one, anointed by God and everything. So here they have the idea of the prophet, and then the messiahs of Aaron and Israel, the Aaronic Messiah being the priestly Messiah, and the Messiah of Israel being the kingly Messiah. So it may be a reflection of an idea where you would have three very significant figures filling those respective roles.
That was helpful. Thank you.
Yeah, not a problem. Are there any other comments or questions on any of this? Okay. Well, we've been on for over an hour now, so I'm thinking that we'll bring an end to tonight's meeting, and then tomorrow night we can continue on to different aspects. Would anyone like to thank our Heavenly Family?
I'd be happy to.
Awesome.
Heavenly Family, thank you for setting aside special times each week and each day and each year and all of that to meet with us in a more intimate way and to consider our needs and invite us to rest and all of that. And we thank you that during these times we can learn more about you and learn more about just how things have developed over the years and millennia even in humanity's understanding of you and how you intend to wipe away sin in our lives and in this world. And so I just want to thank you for the Sabbath, and I want to thank you for our time together studying and how you're teaching us to be critical thinkers. And, I just want to ask that each one of us would really take advantage of our time with you over the next 24 hours or so, depending on our time zone, and that we would come to understand your love better So thank you for educating us. Thank you for loving us. And we ask that you guide us to effectively do your work and to have a heart, a burden to do your work. We thank you so much, and we ask all this and thank you in the name of Branch. Amen.
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 All right. Love you all. Shalom.
Thank you. Shalom.
Laila Tov.
Laila Tov.
Lila Tov.